Hi, I'm Leo Freed, and you're watching Fox News. Today's topic of discussion is the recurring incidence of national identity throughout Europe and the rest of the world. National identity is the pride that one feels for their country, the patriotic feeling that drives people around the world to help their country thrive, and in more radical cases, attempt at world domination. The effects of national identity is present all throughout European and modern history. Starting with the 100 Years' War in 1337, Joan of Arc, a woman from France who single-handedly instilled national identity or nationalism into her country. Spreading the words of various saints, Joan of Arc was able to create a sense of pride for the country of France. As historian Stephen Ritchie quotes, "The people who came after her in the 5 centuries since her death tried to make everything of her. Dynamic fanatic, spiritual mystic, not even tragically ill-used tool of the powerful creator, an icon of modern popular nationalism, adored heroine, saint. She insisted, even when threatened with torture and faced with death by fire, that she was guided by the voices of God. Voices or no voices, her achievements leave anyone who knows her story shaking his head in amazement." End quote. Stephen Ritchie's quote suggests that Joan of Arc was a pioneer of nationalism. She stuck to her beliefs in order for her country to find victory. Even when being tortured, her national identity was intact and she fought for her country. With the help of Charles VII, Joan of Arc was able to rally the people of her great country together, where they eventually claimed victory against the English. Joan of Arc's passionate work throughout the war left a major impact on the continent of Europe and the country of France. Almost 400 years after Joan of Arc's death, the great leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, would use nationalism to help rebuild his country. Napoleon Bonaparte, who is from France, was a major political and military leader of his time. Following the chaos of Maximilien Robespierre and the Reign of Terror, Napoleon Bonaparte used national identity or nationalism to help reunify France. He reigned as Emperor of France from 1804 to 1850, during which he formed the Napoleonic Code, which would eventually influence many of the laws of jurisdiction around the world. The role of national identity throughout Napoleon's time has left a legacy throughout the world. As Napoleon quotes, "My true goal is not to have won 40 battles. Waterloo will erase the memory of so many victories, but will live forever is my civil code." Like Joan of Arc, Napoleon was able to rally the people of France together and result in many glorious victories. Napoleon's work with nationalism also influenced the unification of Germany and the unification of Italy. The countries of Germany and Italy expanded off of not only Napoleon's code, but his ideas pertaining to nationalism. Both these countries used national identity to attract their civilians to want to thrive and establish a more powerful nation. Napoleon's work clearly helped push nationalism throughout the early European history. Similar to Napoleon Bonaparte's use of nationalism, one of the most famous uses is that of Nazi Germany. Nazism is a variation of fascism, designed to divert the attention and ideas of the German workers away from communism and towards nationalism. Led by possibly the greatest leader of all time, Adolf Hitler, the Germans used nationalism to rebuild their country following World War I. With inflation harassing the German economy, Adolf Hitler planted the idea of a new, more powerful Germany into the minds of his people. Using this idea, the Germans not only disregarded the new restraints put on them following World War I, and among other things, they rebuilt their economy and militarized in the demilitarization zone. Adolf Hitler's influence did not stop there. In the early to mid 1930s, Hitler developed the idea of a super race. He wanted to create a world where the Aryan race dominated the world, as well as the German culture and ideas. These ideas or a radical sense of nationalism led to the start of World War II, and on September 1st, unfortunately, 1939, the start of World War II. The use of nationalism throughout Nazi Germany became very radical. They wanted their country to thrive so much to the point where they were determined to gain world domination and develop a superior race, which resulted in the death of over 6 million people during the Holocaust, of course. Clearly, the use of nationalism by Nazi Germany does not demonstrate the better sides of nationalism. Here I have with me a distinguished professor of history, Dr. Peter Fried. Dr. Fried, how has European nationalism impacted the course of history over the last 5 centuries?
Well, Leo, that's a very interesting question that I'm happy to expand upon. European nationalism resulted after the Dark Ages. The fiefdoms of the feudal state were replaced by monarchy nations. And these monarchy nations were able to cohesively bring together a group of people. And once people, regardless of who they are, where they are, can work together, certain things happen. So the feudal chaos was replaced by a homogeneous state. And quite soon after, they started to look beyond their borders. And the first thing that happened was truly in the late 1400s exploration. And whether it be Spain, Queen Isabella, backing Columbus, or the King of Portugal, Henry IV, I believe it was, uh, backing his sailors, they began to explore the world. This exploration uh, led to greater power for these countries. These nations became more and more powerful. And as a result of this power, let's see what happened in history. Number one, the slave trade happened because these colonies in the New World needed slaves to produce the goods, to bring them to the Old World, to sustain the factories, the Industrial Revolution. So, right away from these nations, we get exploration of the New World. We get the Industrial Revolution with the triangle trade with slaves and raw products coming from the New World and then bring them to the Old World. As nations began to grow, as these nations began to grow throughout Europe, naturally friction developed. These colonies started, uh, uh, all these countries wanted the colonies, wanted the riches, and wars broke out. These nations became naturally competitive. And what was in the past a religious wars or wars between different peoples became war between nations. And these wars uh, resulted in the Great War of World War One. So what happened was these countries that were had completely colonized the world. There was no more colonies to capture. Africa had been colonized. South America had been colonized. Asia had been colonized, and as a result, there was no more room to grow, and they started looking at each other. World War One. World War One was a direct result of nationalism fueled by fascism and other ideas, communism as well.
World War One.
World War One, yes. World War One was preceded by things in the 1900s by areas in Morocco where the Germans and the Americans even were at it. Um, World War II was another example of nationalism and how Hitler was able to, as well as Mussolini, as well as Tojo and the Japanese, able to bring national pride to a epidemic, fervent level with fascism and anti-Semitism, and really developed an almost religious tone to the nationalism. Um, the nationalism still went on to the late 20th century, is impacted today because these nations that created the colonies, such as Syria, such as Iraq, created colonies that were not based on ethnicity or tribal, but just on where people decided to draw borders. Today, we're faced with the problems in Syria, which is tearing apart in strife between Sunnis and Shiites and Alawites and Kurds over borders that were drawn as a result of colonialism and nationalism. So what happened in the 1400s as a result of the end of the Dark Ages, we're still feeling today uh, as a result of nationalism.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure, and good luck to you, sir.
Thank you. At the start of the Cold War in 1947, the intentions and motivations of all participating countries were based off nationalism. In some cases, countries like Vietnam and Laos began to fight for their freedom. They created a national identity in which they wanted to be free from colonial rule. This is where leaders like Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong of Vietnam and China began to rise and have a more influential impact on their people. As a result, the containment theory arose, an idea in which the U.S. used to contain communism and spread democracy, which was a somewhat nationalist idea. This led to the wars in both Vietnam and Korea, which were both viewed as failures. In other cases, nationalism started a rivalry between various countries. Although most communists were against nationalism, it turned out that the communist countries of China and the Soviet Union perhaps took the most pride in their national identity. Once again, these parties strove to build a better country. This eventually led to the arms races between the US and the USSR. These countries began a competition on over who could build the more powerful and destructive weapons. This race eventually led to the creation of the hydrogen bomb and other weapons of mass destruction that could create nuclear holocausts and which eventually led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. This caused an unneeded sense of fear and terror within both countries, to the point where civilians began to build bomb shelters in their basements and children were taught to duck and cover in their classrooms. The sense of pride that the US and the USSR had for their countries not only created tensions between the two, but instilled fear into its people as well. The passion to be the most powerful country led to the need to have the best and most latest weaponry. The strife between the US and the USSR during the Cold War was directly caused by nationalism. Nationalism has played a major role in the development of the world today. Nationalism has helped develop new foreign policies. For example, in order to maintain their success, the U.S. began to change their policies on foreign entanglement. In other parts around the world, nationalism has influenced the intentions of various radical groups, such as the unfortunate events of 9/11 or the Boston bombing. These groups are working for their superior beliefs, even though it is being done in inhumane ways. Nationalism, or national identity, has had an enormous impact on European and modern history. It has truly shaped the world today and is still a powerful motivation throughout the world. This concludes today's segment of nationalism. Thanks for watching the news.